Imagine this. It's the 14th century, and you live under one of the Mongol Khanates as, say, a soldier. But unfortunately, there are a lot of you and not much food. What is a result of famine? Lowered immune systems. With all the traveling you do, it's hard not to pick up a few nasty little diseases, such as the Black Plague. But more importantly, it's hard not to spread these diseases to other people you come into contact with. As a Mongol soldier, the people you come into contact with is all of Eurasia. AP World History Key Concept 3.1, Number 4. There is a continued diffusion of crops and pathogens, including epidemic diseases like the bubonic plague, throughout the Eastern Hemisphere along the trade routes. The Black Plague, also known as the Black Death, is a prime example of the spread of disease throughout the civilized world during the 14th century. While it wasn't the only plague known to medieval Europe, it was certainly the worst. And while it wasn't the only plague known to human history, having competitors in smallpox, which plagued Europe and was brought to America with explorers, and in the plague experienced during the Columbian Exchange, creatively called the Great Dying, it was inarguably a force to be reckoned with. So for now, let's focus on the Black Plague. Its first documented victims were in China, and it seems to have spread from there through Indian Ocean trade routes and the Silk Road, into India, Persia, Syria, and Egypt. A major player in this pandemic was, you guessed it, the Mongols. Their merchants and soldiers traveled the world, and while that was great for economy and commerce, it wasn't so great for health. They left unburied corpses wherever they went, which in turn contaminated water supply. Their soldiers were many, and, as we talked about earlier, they spread disease wherever they went. The Mongols also just loved capturing artisans and merchants who they sent across trade routes, which meant the spread of both culture and of disease. And of course, there was that one time they threw diseased bodies over the walls of Kaffa. Probably not helping. In October of 1347, Genoese plague ships arrived in Messina via the Black Sea, carrying mainly dead sailors and a few very shaken survivors. They had huge black boils and consequently, though not single-handedly, introduced the Black Plague into Great Britain by 1348. The seafaring sick helped spread disease this way in many different instances, traveling to different ports looking for shelter. These ports turned them away, but the rats on their ships hopped right off and into the cities. By 1350, the Black Plague had reached Scandinavian countries, and by 1351, it was in Russia. But let's go back to those rats, because the Black Plague has to have some origin, right? Well, it was believed to have been a disease called the bubonic plague, originating in bacteria called Yersinia pestis. Black rats caught the plague, fleas jumped onto those rats and caught it as well, and the fleas jumped onto humans. Also, it may be prudent to mention that trading during the 14th century was more active than ever, and new technologies and crops were being introduced through trade routes. The diffusion of crops and pathogens, beginning in Mongolia and spreading outwards, held much of the plague. Champa rice in East Asia and bananas from Southeast Asia into Africa held the plague, as well as cotton, sugar, and citrus, which were spread throughout the Islamic world. All of these traveled the Silk Road, which brought the disease from China and Central Asia into places further west, reaching its most infamous breeding ground, Great Britain. Once the plague, through whatever channels, reached its destination, it caught like wildfire, especially in Britain. Why? Well, Britain had all of the things that the plague loved most. Terrible sanitary systems with sewage water in the rivers and human waste dumped into the streets, animals carrying the plague walking in cities, and dense population allowing the plague to hop from person to person. So what do people do when a mysterious illness causes their loved ones to grow black boils, spit blood, and drop like flies with no reasonable explanation? They make up their own explanations, of course. Unsurprisingly, many Christian Europeans decided this was the wrath of God, and some began repenting in gruesome ways. Priests went to bless the sick and brought illness back to monasteries, therefore wiping out much of the monasteries in medieval Europe. They also thought it was a great idea to rub feces over their sick to ward off the smell, which they thought spread disease, and they told people not to bathe or wear clean clothes in fear of opening pores to plague. Shockingly, none of this helped. What else could have been the cause? The planets? Sure. Jews? Why not? Bad air? Yep. Speaking of bad air, many people calling themselves plague doctors went around trying to cure the sick, wearing masks stuffed full of smelly stuff, whether pleasant or unpleasant, to ward off bad air. These people were not actually doctors, of course. In fact, one was found to have previously been a fruit salesman. People were freaking out. Some abandoned their homes and ran to the countryside. The dead were buried in pits. The upper class lost many traditions because this situation was so dire. The city of Ragusa created a quarantine. Actually, that was a really good idea. Props to Ragusa. On the bright side, the number of people killed by the plague meant that labor wasn't so easily found anymore. People could demand higher payment for work and a larger middle class began to develop in Europe. Lots of literature relating to the plague was created, as well as some art. People stopped using thatched roofing and wooden walls because rats could easily live there, and more advanced building materials became popularized, such as tiled roofing and bricks. Natural selection kicked in, and many people developed much stronger immune systems, including a gene that helped fight the plague. In the end, the plague killed 1/3 of the population in China and Britain, ultimately over 50 million people. Deurbanization occurred because all of the people running away, lawlessness ran rampant, and the population didn't get back up to where it had been for another 3 centuries. The Catholic Church was questioned because it couldn't cure the plague, paving the way for the Protestant Reformation. China's population fell and the government weakened, contributing to the fall of the Yuan dynasty. The Black Death had other outbreaks later, as recently as 1994. So beware. Thanks for watching.